I'm Kale, and today I'm looking at the Beatles' self-titled White Album. Before we get into full swing in this video, I just want to say that this video is going to be a season finale of sorts for Crate Digging. After this episode, I'm going to take like a 3-week break, and then I'll be back to the regular scheduled uploading. And since it was a finale, I thought, what a better album to do than this hour-and-a-half monster. 93 minutes and 30 songs. The White Album is the Beatles' 10th studio album, preceded by Magical Mystery Tour and followed by Abbey Road a year later. And the recording of this album is when the band really started to fall apart. Pretty sure I've said that in every single Beatles video I've done, but still. Drug habits were getting high, Yoko Ono was finally in the picture, just a lot of things that were not very historically good for the Beatles. But anyway, the personnel. Personnel is John Lennon on vocals, all types of guitars, bass guitar, acoustic guitar, electric guitar, rhythm guitar, piano, organs, all types of different keyboards, and various percussion. Paul McCartney on all types of guitars, bass guitar, acoustic guitar, rhythm guitar, lead guitar, keyboards, piano, organ, drums, and percussion, basically the same as Lennon. George Harrison on all types of guitars, percussion, and vocals. And Ringo Starr on drums, percussion, and a bunch of other percussion instruments. Additional personnel is George Martin, who produced the album. Yoko Ono, Pattie Boyd, and Maureen Starkey all provide backing vocals. Al Evans on backing vocals, hand claps, and trumpet. Jack Fallon on fiddle. And Eric Clapton on guitar. Now let's get into the background/recording. Story of the White Album starts in early 1968 when all the Beatles went to Rishikesh, India to study transcendental meditation with the Maharishi Mahesh Yogi. And now at this camp, this is basically where like all of the songs on the White Album were written. There's maybe 3 songs on this album that weren't written in India. The trip to India also established a lot of tensions between the band. Not all of them really wanted to stay. Ringo left the first like a week into the trip because he was allergic to everything and he was allergic to all the food. This band brought an entire suitcase filled with Heinz baked beans. He just had a suitcase in his room that was just filled to the brim with beans. That's not even a joke. He just had a suitcase of beans with him. And once his bean stash ran out, he just left. Paul left like 2 months into the trip, and then George Harrison and John Lennon left at the same time in late April of 1968. While they were in India, the single Lady Madonna and Inner Light was released, which they recorded in very late 1967. And at the very start of the recording sessions for this album, they recorded 2 new non-album singles, Hey Jude, backed with Revolution, double A side. The album was recorded primarily at EMI Studios in London, and some were recorded at George's house. During the recording of this album, they thought up the idea of creating an independent label, and they did. They went through with it, and it was called Apple Records. They signed new artists like Jackie Lomax, James Taylor, Badfinger, and Marianne Faithfull. However, the label was mostly dissolved by the mid-70s because of, I don't know, Alan Klein. Don't know exactly what he did, but I know it was something bad. And only 16 out of the 30 tracks on this album contain all of the Beatles on them. Because, for one, basically, halfway through the recording of the album, Ringo was really fed up about how everyone was bossing him around and wouldn't just let him drum how he wanted to drum, so he left the group for 2 weeks straight on vacation in Greece. And this was one of the deciding factors that the Beatles almost broke up. Like, when Ringo left, they considered just disbanding completely. But Ringo came back 2 weeks later, did overdubs on the album, and then before you know it, the album was complete. The first recording sessions for the album was held in mid-May of 1968, and the final recording session was October 13th of 1968. And the album was released November 22nd, 1968. 5-year anniversary of their second album with the Beatles being released. I did a pretty condensed version of the recording parts because the track-by-track breakdown is going to be the very meaty part of this video. There's 30 tracks. It's gonna take a while. That's why this is the season finale, because I have to go over 30 songs. Well, 29 songs and one freak of nature. But anyway, with that, I say that we get into the track-by-track breakdown. 1 is Back in the USSR. Back in the USSR is a parody surf rock song of both Back in the USA by Chuck Berry and California Girls by the Beach Boys. The song came about in Rishikesh when Paul McCartney joked to Mike Love of the Beach Boys about making a song like California Girls, except for cities in California. He replaced it with territories in the Soviet Union. And they thought this was funny, so he straight up just made this as a song. This was one of the first songs affected by Ringo leaving. This is actually one of the reasons why Ringo left, is because he tried doing drum takes on the song, but Paul McCartney kept going, So Paul McCartney did it himself, and that angered Ringo so much that he left for 2 weeks, probably to go eat some beans in Greece or something. And since Paul was playing drums, he didn't feel bothered to play bass, so he made John play a 6-string bass. I don't know why Mike Love doesn't have writing credits on the song, maybe because he didn't help directly with any lines, but I think that is an astute decision, because I hate Mike Love with all of my heart. Mike Love deserves no writing credits ever. Track number 2 is Dear Prudence. Dear Prudence was also written in Rishikesh by John about actress Mia Farrow's sister Prudence Farrow. Halfway through the course, kind of suffered a mental breakdown and didn't talk to anyone for like 3 weeks. The finger-picking style, acoustic guitar that's used throughout the song, was taught to him by Scottish singer Donovan, who I talked about in the Revolver video, who contributed some lines to Yellow Submarine. Like a mystery surrounding this song on who played drums on it. It's because the song was recorded while Ringo was in Greece, but it doesn't have the same drumming style as Paul, so everyone is just like, oh, it's a mystery, so it was a mystery drummer, but I just feel like it's very obviously Ringo's drumming style, and it was probably just Ringo came back and was like, hey, I'm back, and then they were like, hey, do some overdubs, so we did an overdub on Dear Prudence. I really don't think it's like that much of a mystery. A lot of sources mark it as Paul, but I really don't think it is, because it's not really his drumming style, unless it was like him trying to imitate Ringo. Track number 3 is Glass Onion. Glass Onion is sort of like a tribute song to themselves. It has like a bunch of references to other Beatles songs in it. Another cool fact, Glass Onion was a suggested name by John Lennon to, at the time, unnamed group who just signed to Apple Records, who would later become Badfinger. Glass Onion's an interesting song. It's like a James Bond song, you know? It's like a spy thriller song. I used to think the string arrangement in it was over the top, but it's really one of like George Martin's best arrangements, because it sort of acts as like a medley almost. Not a direct medley in the way that it contains all of the other Beatles song string arrangements, but it feels like if like Beatles string arrangement, if it was like a preset. I think Glass Onion and I Am the Walrus are 2 of George Martin's best compositions orchestrally. Next up is Obla Di Obla Da, written 100% by Paul McCartney. And it's one of the first, if not the first, pop song that hit Western radio to incorporate elements of ska and reggae and Jamaican folk. Also, all of the Beatles except for Paul hate this song with a burning passion, because like a lot of Paul songs on this album, he forced them to sit down and do like 600 takes of this song just straight through for 10 hours. Paul was really just pissing everyone off during these recording sessions, dude. He was just making everyone angry to no end. Paul McCartney's actually just the ultimate troll. So there's also some drama with Obla Di Obla Da. The title expression was famously used by Nigerian English singer Jimmy Scott, or allegedly famously used by Jimmy Scott. And Scott claimed that the Beatles ripped him off. He tried to obtain royalties and writing credits for years, but then he just kind of gave up. This song is on like numerous worst songs of all time list, and it's just, I don't get it. Why? It's just a fun song. Just let people have a fun song. Just because John Lennon says he hates it does not mean you have to hate it too. I swear to God, that's critics' basis on like 99% of songs, whether Pete Townsend or John Lennon like or dislike it. It's like they're cranky British men. They don't like anything. Next up is Wild Honey Pie. Wild Honey Pie is just an interlude. It's not really a song. It's an interlude between Obla Di Obla Da, the continuing story about Bungalow Bill. It's just Paul McCartney using a slide on an acoustic guitar rhythmically saying honey pie for 52 seconds straight. And when I was little, this song used to freak me out, dude. Like, this song would come on, like Obla Di Obla Da would end, and I would just like start freaking out. Like I would start like sweating, like anticipating this song to come next. I don't know why I couldn't just be like, hey, skip this song, but I was always just terrified of this song. But yeah, anyway, the next song is the continuing story of Bungalow Bill. Bungalow Bill was the last song recorded for the album, recorded 5 days before mixing started. The song was written about a hunter that accompanied the Beatles to Rishikesh, who was there to visit his mom, and at the time he was bragging to everybody about how he was gonna go out and kill one specific tiger. The song begins with a Mellotron tape loop of a man playing flamenco guitar. No one knows who's the original owner of the sample or where it comes from, but it was just preset on the Mellotron. I guess technically it's the first piece of lost media in this album. I swear, like every other song, I'm going to be talking about more lost media. They're the most documented band in the world until it comes to this album specific. The next song is While My Guitar Gently Weeps. Bungalow Bill directly interludes into While My Guitar Gently Weeps by John Lennon saying, hey, and then him getting cut off. First George Harrison song on the album, and it is a doozy. Arguably one of the best Beatles songs of all time. The song was co-written between George Harrison and Eric Clapton of the Yardbirds and Cream. Harrison also co-wrote Cream's 1969 single Bad with Clapton. Eric Clapton famously plays lead guitar on the song and the guitar solo that closes out the song for the last minute and a half. It's widely considered to be one of the best guitar solos of all time. Also, another thing about Eric Clapton, I might have mentioned this in my first video on this channel about Let It Be, but during the Get Back Let It Be sessions when George Harrison left for 2 weeks, just like Ringo, and like left the band for 2 weeks, they were very much considering using Eric Clapton as the stand-in guitarist, or just the guitarist period for the Beatles, since at this time Cream had just broke up and he was solo. So they were like, hey, why isn't Eric Clapton a new Beatle? They didn't go through with this because then George ended up coming back, but still, that would have been, wonder how that would have altered the history of the Beatles. The lyrics of the song are supposedly with the pessimism of the Western world after the assassination of MLK Jr. and Bobby Kennedy. Next up is Happiness is a Warm Gun. Happiness is a Warm Gun is a bit of a musical suite comprised of 3 different parts. The first part being called The Dirty Old Man, the second part being called The Junkie, and the last part being called The Gunman. They were all called this by Lennon. The first part is sort of an acoustic fingerstyle guitar section, and then the second part is more electric and like faster, and then the last part is like a parody of 50s rock and roll, sort of. The song is either about gun laws or John Lennon's lust for Yoko Ono, and it's probably the second one. And the title of the song is based off the Peanuts comic Happiness is a Warm Beagle. And the first part of the song, like the Dirty Old Man section, really reminds me of like a Radiohead song. Next up is Martha My Dear. Martha My Dear is about Paul McCartney's breakup with his longtime girlfriend Jane Asher, but the name Martha is based off of his sheepdog, and I like to think that the song is just about his dog, because that is a much better thing to write a song about. It expands on Paul McCartney's recurring theme of using music hall elements, the first of a few on this album, most notably preceded by Your Mother Should Know on Magical Mystery Tour. Next up is I'm So Tired. Me too, John, me too. I'm So Tired was written by Lennon in Rishikesh when he was having a flare-up of his insomnia, where basically he just did not sleep for like 2 weeks straight. It's like the more desperate, depressed sequel to I'm Only Sleeping on Revolver. So had sort of an addiction to cigarettes at the time, so he calls Walter Raleigh, who was the knight who brought tobacco back to the UK from the Americas, a git, which after further research is a British insult, which means stupid. Let's have a lot of words for people that are stupid. Next up is Blackbird. Blackbird is another song in the album that contains literally just Paul McCartney, no other musicians, no other Beatles, just Paul McCartney and an acoustic guitar. One of 3 songs on the album that's just Paul McCartney and his acoustic guitar. Basically, the song is about the growing racial tensions in the American South in the mid to late 60s. Specifically written after the assassination of Martin Luther King Jr. It's also one of the Beatles' most famous songs, and just Paul McCartney's most famous songs. He plays it at he played it and plays it at like every single concert he does. Next up is Piggies. Piggies was written by George Harrison. I think I talked about this in the Revolver video. It was written by George Harrison in late 1965 or early 1966, so like a full 2 years before this album was even conceived. He wrote it at the same time that he wrote Taxman, and both the songs are kind of have the same message. While Taxman calls out the British government specifically, Piggies is more just about his hatred for capitalism, comparing politicians in the 60s to pampered pigs living on a farm. I guess George Harrison was just feeling very politically charged during the Revolver sessions. But I thought this, when I learned that this was written during the Revolver sessions, what a Revolver version of Piggies would sound like. Like, would it be the Baroque pop, sort of medieval pop sort of sound, or would it be something completely different? What would a Taxman style Piggies sound like? Like a garage rock pig? Like in this scenario, what if George Harrison ended up using Piggies for Revolver and Taxman for the White Album? I'm just thinking out loud right now, but you know, I would like to hear both of them. But we can't talk about the White Album without talking about Charles Manson, so let's get that out of the way for a little bit right now. Basically, Piggies was one of the main songs that gave Charles Manson clues on an impending race war in the United States. And a few songs on this album gave him clues so much to start a fire in his brain about this race war, which ultimately led to the Tate LaBianca murders in the summer of 1969. Apparently, the inspiration from this song came from the line, "What they need is a damn good whacking." So in Charles's mind, that meant everyone on Earth deserved to be shot and killed. What a silly little guy. Next up is Rocky Raccoon. Rocky Raccoon is like a country ragtime honky-tonk sort of song ballad. It's like a country western ballad about a cowboy who gets into a duel with the man who stole his girlfriend, and then he ends up losing. It's sadly the last appearance in the Beatles' discography where John Lennon shows off his harmonica skills, the first being Love Me Do, which was their first ever song. The song's story is based off of an 1890s magazine story from California called The Shooting of Tim McGrew, which is basically just like Rocky Raccoon, but different names. Anyway, next up is Don't Pass Me By. Don't Pass Me By is the first official composition written by Ringo Starr in Beatles history, yet far. Yet far. Is that a term? Do people say that? I don't know. It's a very country-heavy song because it was written by Ringo in 1964, in late 1964, when Beatles for Sale was released, and they were on their, like, country western kick. Ringo wrote Don't Pass Me By for Beatles for Sale, but he never shared it with anyone, really. However, there is a BBC radio interview from 1964 in which Ringo sings a little snippet of the song because the interviewer was like, "Ringo, are you writing any songs?" And then he started singing like the little bit of the chorus of this. In 1969, it was released as a single in Denmark only, and it peaked at #1 on Denmark's Billboard Hot 100. Meaning that if you went up to a Danish person and you were like, "What are the Beatles' top 5 greatest hits?" they'd be like, "Love Me Do, Please Please Me, Blackbird Yesterday, Don't Pass Me By." Huh? I'd say like casual Beatles fans don't even know what Don't Pass Me By is. I mean, everyone in Denmark singing Don't Pass Me By. If you're Danish and you don't know Don't Pass Me By, what are you doing with your life? Seriously though, if there's any Danish people watching this video, can you comment on that? Like, is Don't Pass Me By like a legitimate famous song in Denmark? Next up is Why Don't We Do It in the Road. It's about 2 monkeys mating in the street. And that is all. The song is just Paul on piano and Ringo on drums. And it is definitely a song on this album. Maybe it's 28 songs in Two Freaks of Nature. Next up is I Will. Your ears can be cleansed after Why Don't We Do It in the Road. I Will, as of now, is probably my favorite Beatles song. It's the second song on the album that's literally just Paul McCartney and an acoustic guitar. And there is a bass line in the background, but it's just Paul McCartney vocalizing it. After that is Julia. Julia was performed entirely by John Lennon with just him and the acoustic guitar. Sort of like I Will. It's like Lennon and McCartney both just sitting there in a room with an acoustic guitar. It's about Lennon's mother, Julia, who was killed after she got hit by a car in June of 1958 when Lennon was 18 years. Another song where Lennon uses the finger picking style, which he learned from Donovan in. And next up is Birthday. Birthday is another McCartney song that every other Beatles hates with a burning passion. I don't know, I think it's alright. It's like Obla Di Obla Da. It's just a fun, happy song, and people hate it because happiness is bad to them or something. Okay, after Birthday is Your Blues. Your Blues is straight up just a Texas blues. And it's sort of a parody of the English, blues, explosion that was happening at the time. You know, parodying bands like the Yardbirds, Led Zeppelin, Fleetwood Mac. In late 1968, John Lennon formed a supergroup called the Dirty Mac, consisting of him on rhythm guitar and lead vocals, Eric Clapton on lead guitar, Keith Richards on bass, and Mitch Mitchell of the Jimi Hendrix Experience on drums. And they formed this specifically for Rolling Stones' Rock and Roll Circus, which is now the third video where that has been brought up. And on the Rock and Roll Circus, they performed two songs. They performed Your Blues, and they performed a 4-minute jam called Whole Lotta Yoko. This performance was immediately followed by The Who's performance of A Quick One While He's Away, and then that performance was followed by Jethro Tull, and then that performance was followed by the Rolling Stones' final performance. That was a crazy movie, dude. I have talked about 3 of those performances directly in one of my videos. 3 of my videos, not one of my. Next up is Mother Nature's Son. Mother Nature's Son was partly based on Nat King Cole's song Nature Boy, but it was also just inspired by Paul McCartney's general love of nature. And it was composed within the first 2 weeks of being in India. It is the 3rd song on this album, which contains just Paul McCartney and his acoustic guitar. And he recorded this by himself without the band's permission. They were originally all going to perform it together somehow. And then they walked in on him during the final, when he was finishing up recording, and they got really mad at him. And this was one of the things that caused Ringo to leave. It was famously covered in 1972 by John Denver on his album Rocky Mountain High. And at one point, it was also one of my favorite Beatles songs, and it still kind of is, actually. I'm a fan of the Paul McCartney solo acoustic guitar songs. Next up is Everybody's Got Something to Hide Except for Me and My Monkey. That is the entire title of that song. Everybody's Got Something to Hide Except for Me and My Monkey is basically just John Lennon very fastly chanting the Maharishi's mantras. And it's considered one of the first punk songs and is generally categorized as a proto-punk song. When you listen to it and then compare it to some of the punk music from the mid to late 70s, it is really an influential song in that way. I originally proposed that the song was about John Lennon's heroin addiction, but that has been proven false time and time again. Next up is Sexy Sadie. Now, this is not my words, this is the internet's words, but apparently Sexy Sadie is considered the world's first ever diss track. Who was John Lennon dissing, you may ask? Well, he was dissing the Maharishi. Now, wait a second, wasn't he just praising him literally one song ago? Yes. Basically, the song was written after John Lennon found out about the Maharishi's sexual misconduct with 10 people at the camp. That was one of the reasons why John Lennon left, because he didn't like the Maharishi anymore. Knowing all of this, still 20% of the songs on this album are praising him. It's like he changed his mind day to day. So another thing is that the song really reminds me of a Pixies song, sort of. And Happiness is a Warm Gun is Radiohead, and then Sexy Sadie is the Pixies. Oh boy, and next up is Helter Skelter. Helter Skelter is considered to be the first ever real metal song. Helter Skelter and Electric Ladyland by Jimi Hendrix, that whole album, which were both released the same year, are crazy factors in the founding of metal. And then Black Sabbath, which formed 2 months after this album was released. The song was written in late 1967 by Paul McCartney after he read an interview in Melody Maker with Pete Townsend of The Who was like, yeah, our new song, I Can See for Miles, it's basically the heaviest song in the world. Nothing will ever top how crazy heavy this song. So Paul was like, oh yeah, Pete, watch this. And then he wrote a song and didn't release it for another year. And also, I don't know what Pete was talking about. I Can See for Miles is really not that hard of a song. There were much more heavy, intense songs released in 1967 than I Can See for Miles. There are more heavy Who songs that were released a year previous. Boris the Spider Boris the Spider, that's the first black metal song. Boris the Spider is way heavier than I Can See for Miles, and I would argue in some ways that it's heavier than Helter Skelter. But, putting Boris the Spider aside, I got distracted by there. You guys know how much I love Boris the Spider. But yeah, Helter Skelter is considered to be one of the first metal songs. There's also another major factor in Charles Manson's tiny little brain that he wanted to kill everyone on Earth. I don't really know why. The song's about a slide. Every other Beatle hates this song for the same reason. Paul McCartney sat them down in the room and was like, we're gonna get this right. There are literally like hundreds of takes of this. Like, that's not even exaggeration. There are hundreds of takes of this song. There's one take that's 25 minutes long, but it's lost. There's the second piece of lost media. Ringo shouts at the very end, I got blisters on my fingers, because he literally did. Because Paul McCartney sat them all down and made them play the song for 10 hours straight. I'm surprised Ringo only had blisters. I'm surprised his hands didn't just fall off. Basically, the song fades out like halfway through, and then it fades back, and then it fades out again. At which point, Ringo screams the fact that he does in fact have blisters on his fingers. I got blisters on my fingers! Next up is Long, Long, Long. Long, Long, Long is like a song that viscerally disturbs me, and I don't know why. Like, more so than Revolution 9. It's also just kind of a boring song. To me, it's the worst song on the album. The only thing it has going for it is that it's loosely based on some songs for music from Big Pig, the studio album by the band. And by the band, I don't mean the Beatles, I mean the band. Next up is Revolution 1. Now, everyone who listens to Revolution 1 is like, oh, it's a version of their single Revolution. But it's the other way around. The single version of Revolution is actually based off of this. Basically, in May of 1968, John called everyone up and was like, hey, I got this new idea for a single. It's called Revolution. So everyone gets there and he does a solo take just to tell everyone what it would be like. And then they do a second take with the whole band. This second take is Revolution 1. And after they finish Revolution 1, John's like, so what do you think? We could release this as a single? And Paul goes, yeah, but it's a little slow. I feel like we need something more intense for a single. So after that, they record a more up-tempo and hard rocky take, and then that is released as a single, and then that's Revolution. So I always thought the Revolution 1 was a version of Revolution, but Revolution's actually a version of Revolution 1. And then there was a jam that led off of Revolution 1, like the original take, that turned very avant-garde, and then the beginnings of that were the inner workings of Revolution 9. Honey Pie is another ragtime vaudeville sort of song. It's like a music hall vaudeville song about a woman who travels from England to the United States and becomes a famous actress. A very 20s concept. Music hall is so heavily incorporated in Paul's songs because that's the music that he grew up with his dad, because his dad played in like a vaudeville sort of band. Honey Pie is also another really hated Beatles song, not only by the members themselves, but by like fans. I don't know, I think it's alright. I think it's better than Long, Long, Long. Not enough people hate on Long, Long, Long. Next up is Savoy Truffle. Savoy Truffle is written by George Harrison about Eric Clapton's crippling chocolate addiction. And that's not a euphemism. He just, really liked chocolate. And weirdly enough, it was covered by Ella Fitzgerald in 1969. It's sort of soul in the way that Got to Get You to My Life is soul. Next up is Cry Baby Cry. Cry Baby Cry was written in the Magical Mystery Tour sessions in 1967, and it was based off an ad slogan. There were demos for it recorded in late 1967. I've found that on multiple sources, but I can't find the actual demo, so I'm gonna mark this as the third lost media thing in this video. For a little bit there, it did take the cake as my favorite Beatles song for a few months, but I've now shifted over to I Will and with the Beatles version of You Really Got a Hold on Me. Those are my two current favorite Beatles songs at the moment. The coda of the song at the very end that stuck right in between Cry Baby Cry and Revolution 9 was recorded by Paul and John during sessions for I Will. And it serves as like a terrifying warning for what is about to come. And why don't I talk about what is about to come? What is about to come is Revolution 9. I listened to this entire song for this video. It's an avant-garde sound collage that begins with a tape loop of an EMI sound technician saying number 9 over and over again. And then there's weird reversed mellotron sounds, lots of people talking, lots of people screaming, lots of different instruments, lots of different things, all getting shot in your face at once. The concept of making the sound collage was both kind of inspired by Yoko Ono being in Lennon's life, and the fourth piece of lost media in this video, Carnival of Light. Carnival of Light was a little avant-garde piece made for a rave in 1966 by Paul McCartney and John Lennon. It was a tape filled with just a bunch of random screaming sounds and stuff, and it's not technically lost in the case where no one has it. People have possession of the master tapes, but just no one has released it, and no one knows why. The only people who have heard this song were those people at that rave in 1966. And attached to the tape, attached to the Carnival of Light tape, was a demo of Fixing a Hole. This was around December of 1966, so this is when they were starting to record Sgt. Pepper. And at the rave, they accidentally let Carnival of Light play a little too long and just played the demo for Fixing a Hole. But all I have to say about Revolution 9 is no one actually likes Revolution 9, and if someone comes up to you and is like, I like Revolution 9, they're lying. To themselves and to you. Anyway, finally, the last song on this album, Good Night. Good Night is a lullaby written by John Lennon for his son Julian, and the track on the album is sung by Ringo. When I tell you it's a lullaby, it's literally a lullaby. This thing sounds straight out of a Disney movie. There's no actual, studio instruments, there's no other Beatle on it. There's no other Beatle on it than Ringo. It's just all the orchestral arrangement. And somewhere out there, there's a lost tape by John Lennon that was the original Good Night that he played for Julian before he went to sleep. And that is the final piece of lost media on this album. A tape containing John Lennon on raw vocals on Good Night. And that, after 60,000 years, is the track-by-track breakdown for the White Album. Now let us get into my thoughts. Everyone says this with the White Album, is that there's a lot of filler. And my answer to that is, of course there's a lot of filler, because it's 30 songs. It's 30 songs of the Beatles. Now, when lots of artists release double albums, it's kind of commonplace now, but the fact that the Beatles themselves made a 30-song album is already pretty spectacular. And I know all of the people that are talking about the White Album, like, oh, it could have been a single disc, they could have cut all this crap out. They're the same people that if this was, in fact, a single LP record, and they were finding these lost tracks, like lost track Honey Pie, they'd be like, oh my goodness, they should have released this as on the album. I don't know why they scrapped it. And the White Album isn't my favorite Beatles album, but the fact that there is so many songs on it, that's why, a lot of the songs on the album are my favorite, or were my favorite at one point, because there's 30 of them. That's 2 regular Beatles albums. So, of course, there's going to be more than one of my favorite Beatles songs. They could have scrapped those, Revolution 9. I wouldn't be searching for Revolution 9 and being like, oh, why didn't they put it on the album? A lot of people do that with Carnival of Light, and my take on that is why. You know Carnival of Light is just going to be Revolution 9, but, somewhat different, so why do you want to find it? It's just a bunch of noises. But yeah, very influential album, very good album. I recommend you listen to the 2018 mixes because they sound pristine. But yeah, I'll be back sometime in early January, maybe the first Wednesday of January. But yeah, I'll see you then. Goodbye, bozos.